So Joe Biden's dominance in South Carolina's Democratic primary polls continues in the latest Quinnipiac University poll. The former vice president is in first place with 33% of the support. Elizabeth Warren and Bernie Sanders follow with 13 and 11%, respectively. Mayor Pete is in single digits with 6%, along with Tom Steyer at 5% and Andrew Yang at 4%. And Guy, man, it's early. We'll always say it's early I always think it's early until it's 24 hours before any election. But we certainly are starting to see this field form. Mayor Pete coming on very strong in Iowa. New Hampshire still a battle. But, man, Joe Biden, he is the Teflon man, Teflon Joe in South Carolina. He stays in the 40s there no matter what. What's going on?
Well, first of all, I think one of the most important things is we don't see other candidates really eating into Joe Biden's lead among black voters in South Carolina. And there are huge demographic chasms within the Democratic Party as it relates to the caucus and primary season that I think are really starting to show themselves. Although Joe has stabilized in Iowa and New Hampshire, both of those states are predominantly white. And they tend to be more liberal inside of the caucus and primary, whereas South Carolina is a much more diverse state. And don't forget, we also have the Nevada caucus in between those. And so I think it's reflective of where we see the race. The most important thing, I think, is that Joe Biden has stabilized his race. You know, there was a lot of talk about his decline and whether he would have the money and whether his support would stick with him. But across all of these states, we've seen him hold pretty strong in place over the course of the last couple of weeks, which is really critical for him. But going back to your point, over 50% of caucus and primary goers at this point still say they're open to changing their mind. Among second choice voters, the top four are relatively even between all of these particular races. So I still believe we're going to see a lot of change, more change between now and the Iowa caucus than we have so far this year.
So we talk about it all the time, Mike. Black voters in South Carolina, 44% support Joe Biden. That remains the wall that Mayor Pete is going to have to break through if he wants to become the Democratic nominee, because South Carolina is extremely important because it is the demographic breakdown of what follows for the rest of the primaries, especially a few days later on Super Tuesday when you have a lot of deep South states, you have Texas. If Joe Biden hangs in for South Carolina and wins, let's say he wins it comfortably, Super Tuesday suddenly looks very good for him, and you get 40% of Democratic delegates awarded on that one day.
Yeah, well, as Guy just pointed out, I mean, there's a real resilience in Joe Biden's strength out there, and it props him up. You know, his campaign was listed as dead, Al, about a month ago. You know, KIA, gone. But no, he's still here, still strong in certain aspects. One of the more interesting aspects out there, and it's anecdotal thus far, is what is going on with Elizabeth Warren and her campaign. Since her double foray into explaining her health care plan, one, the cost of it, and then over the weekend, well, you know, maybe 3 years into my first term, we'll get to it. That seems to have piqued some interest in taking a second look at her among voters.
I think that once you get on the main stage and they put the Klieg lights on and you start really looking at them, that's the problem. And I think that some people began looking at the cost of what she was proposing and went another way. On the other issue, though, with Joe Biden, what has been very interesting to me is that none of the candidates have been able to sell black voters, according to the polls, on why they should leave Joe Biden. And that is demonstrated by he has maintained through all of the ups and downs and other polling this solid support among black Americans. This Wednesday night when we have the debate live on MSNBC, the next morning, Mary Pat Hector, who leads our youth division in National Action Network, we're having this big breakfast, and 4 or 5 of the candidates are coming. Buttigieg is one of them, to the breakfast the following morning. They've got to give an argument to black Americans. Why would they go and walk away from Barack Obama's vice president and someone we know? And obviously that argument has not held. They've not been addressed. The worst thing they can walk away from into the Super Tuesday is, well, I'm the candidate that whites will vote for, but blacks and browns don't want me. That is not a path to victory.
Yeah, no, it's not the Democratic Party. Since they're only, well, I'll keep going. I won't talk about the Republican Party. Rev, so early on, Kamala's team, Corey's team thought they were going to do well in South Carolina, thought they were going to do well in the Deep South because of the number of black voters in the Democratic primary. Somebody told me very early on Kamala had a Pac-10 SEC strategy. Going to win on the West Coast, going to win in the Deep South. What's stopping Kamala and Corey from really making gains in South Carolina and across the Deep South?
I think that you can't take black voters for granted just because you're black. When I ran in 2004, and this was in the first election after 9/11, I had to struggle to get to double digits because you had to give a rationale as to why you were running. And I think a lot of people just assume black candidate, you're going to win. That's not true. And if they're not even at double digits in the polls, because you've got to not only address, quote, black issues, and you have to do that because we have specific concerns, you've got to also show that I am who I am, authenticity, that I'm for real and that I can manage this country and be myself and I'm not repackaging myself. I think they've tried to do that, but I don't think they've successfully been able to communicate that to the voters.
Rev mentioned Mayor Buttigieg in this new poll from Quinnipiac. He has less than 1% support among black voters. He's on par with Joe Sestak and Steve Bullock and people who statistically do not even register with African-American voters. That in the same week we saw this huge poll for him in Iowa. So he's got a problem going into South Carolina. Hey, Guy, let me ask you about Priorities USA, that new analysis you guys did, updating spending on Facebook and Google ads compared to President Trump in this race. Tell us about it.
Well, I think there's been a lot of attention on the work that the Trump campaign has been doing online. They have spent tens of millions of dollars on raising money and selling pumpkin-themed MAGA hats and plastic straws and collecting emails. But a lot of that work hasn't been done in the battleground states, and that's really where we've been focused. And over the past 5 months, Priorities has actually outspent Donald Trump in Wisconsin, in Florida, in Pennsylvania, in Michigan, on turning out voters in the off-year elections and on talking to a lot of these suburban voters that we've seen move to the Democratic Party really since the 2016 election. And obviously we saw it a couple of weeks ago in Virginia and Pennsylvania and Kentucky. So it's an area that we're really focused on while Donald Trump is raising money in California and Illinois and New York online. And, you know, we want to make sure that Democrats are focused on both turning out Democratic voters who didn't participate in 2016 and to make sure we're talking to suburban and ex-urban and gettable rural voters to build the broadest coalition possible. And that's why we're as committed as we are online to make sure we're having that conversation.
We saw that suburban trend just the other night in Louisiana as well. Guy Cecil, thanks so much. Always good to see you. Coming up this morning, questions about the credibility of one of today's impeachment probe witnesses ahead of his testimony this morning. Our next guest argues that if you compare Kurt Volker's testimony to that of other witnesses, it appears he may have lied to Congress. We'll explain next on Morning Joe.
Thanks for checking out MSNBC on YouTube, and make sure you subscribe to stay up to date on the day's biggest stories. And you can click on any of the videos around us to watch more from Morning Joe and MSNBC. Thanks so much for watching.